Hey, folks, this is the sort of second part of our preview, although it's going to be done in two parts. So, this is the second part, but there's going to be part one and part two of the second part. So, hopefully, you guys can handle that. We're going to be covering Reconstruction, which is so crucial, but so often misunderstood. And so, again, we're going to be discussing really what happened under Andrew Johnson and then ultimately Ulysses Grant. But really, most importantly, Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson takes over when Lincoln is assassinated. And you're like, well, where did Andrew Johnson come from? Again, he wasn't even Lincoln's vice president for the first 4-year term. That was a guy named Hannibal Hamlin. So Andrew Johnson, who's oftentimes confused with Andrew Jackson, was the only senator from a seceding state. So again, he's a senator from Tennessee that seceded, but he's like, listen, no, I'm not going anywhere. I agree with what the union's doing, so I'm going to stay in D.C. And then Lincoln turns around. He's like, okay, I got a good ally here. And so when Northern forces occupy Tennessee, Lincoln's like, you should be my military governor there. So you're going to be like the man on the ground controlling what's going on. And so in 1864, the Republicans are like, we don't need that guy Hannibal Hamlin anymore. He's from Maine. We need somebody from the South or somebody who's going to help sort of bring this country together. So the Republicans nominate Andrew Johnson as vice president to try to show just sort of like what is possible in terms of sort of Southern loyalty to the Union. So you get Lincoln and Johnson, and no one ever anticipated that Andrew Johnson would be president. And then again, so quickly into his second term, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. And so just as Lincoln, all the way back in 1863 with his, 10% plan, which the radical Republicans like, we don't like the 10% plan, we like the Wade Davis bill, and Lincoln, rejected that, and nothing happened. Now Johnson's going to get a chance to really put his sort of Reconstruction plan into action, because now actually the country needs to be reconstructed because, again, the war is over. He calls his plan actually restoration, whatever. It's basically Reconstruction plan. So a little over a month after Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse, Congress is actually out of session until December. So the war is over, and Johnson looks around and is like, Congress isn't here. I'm going to basically do what I want. So he issues a series of proclamations that are basically what we call presidential reconstruction. So we have presidential reconstruction from 1865 to the beginning of 1867, and then we have something called congressional reconstruction from 1867 to 1877. It's basically who's calling the shots during that time period. So Johnson's plan is to offer a pardon, again, sort of like what Lincoln was doing with his 10% plan with amnesty, which basically says, Southerners, you can get your political and property rights, except for slaves, which you won't get back, obviously, because, again, the 13th Amendment. And basically, it would be applicable to nearly all white Southerners who took an oath of allegiance to the Union. Now, there's certain people that just couldn't get that because they were Confederate leaders or they were really, really wealthy planters. But again, most of those people that were exempted from getting this pardon could get individual pardons from the president. So basically, they could appeal directly to President Johnson, and they could, quote, kiss the ring, and they could come right back in. So really, there was no one who was actually limited from getting these pardons. And so Johnson appointed provisional governors to call state conventions. So every state could have a convention, only elected by whites, not by black people, and that they would create these new governments in the South. Now, these new governments that would be created had to agree to abolish slavery. They had to repudiate secession, say secession was bad, and they had to refuse to pay the Confederate debt, which is losing sides, don't get to have their debt paid by the winning side. So these are all sort of natural things as part of a Southern loss. And he's like, but at the end of the day, that's all you have to do. And in the end, then basically you could manage your own local affairs. Well, what that meant was that, generally speaking, white voters in the South voted for old Confederate leaders and old sort of elite Southerners to come back into power. And so, like, Johnson's plan effectively allowed all these former, Southern power brokers to come right back into power. And all of a sudden, not shockingly, there's violence reported against former slaves and Northerners who are trying to help out freed people. And you're like, well, of course that would happen, because Johnson effectively just created a system for them to come right back into power. So really the consequence of Johnson's lenient plan is that these Southerners put in something called the Black Codes. So prior to the Civil War, we'd seen something called the slave codes going all the way back. Virginia had the first real sort of serious slave codes in 1705, restricting what slaves could do. Now the Black Codes are really going to invite the question to Northerners like, wait, who won the war here? Because now it looks like we're just having a reinvention of the slave codes. So each state sort of had their own codes, just like we had under the slave codes. But by and large, they did allow for certain things. So certain rights were allowed for freed people, like you could get married, you could own property, you could have limited access to the courts. But you didn't have full access because freed people could not testify against white people. They couldn't serve on juries. They couldn't serve in state militias. They couldn't vote. And so at the same time, many white landowners are like, well, we need to make sure that by law, we can have like a captive labor force. So planters demanded that free people be required to work on plantations. And so the Black Codes basically said, if you don't sign a yearly labor contract as a free person with, a white landowner, you could be arrested for vagrancy and then hired out to that landowner. So basically it was like, you have to work in this labor system because if not, you're going to be arrested and then we'll have even more control over you. So the Northerners are looking around going, what happened here? They're like, the end of slavery does not mean freedom at all. And this so clearly violates the free labor principles that we believe in. Like, we've got to do something. So the way that Johnson created such a lenient path back for Southerners to come into power and create these new repressive laws, now the Republicans are going to fight Johnson. Now, Johnson was not, a Republican in the same way that Lincoln had been, and he wasn't one of their own. So they're going to take him on. But if it's going to take a while, it's going to take like about a year throughout really 1866 where they take him on, and they're not even unified, the Republicans. There's the radical Republicans and the moderate Republicans. So when Congress gets back together in December 1865, after being, on recess throughout this whole time that Johnson's doing this, Johnson looks at them and he's like, well, looks like all the southern states have come back in. They've done what we wanted. And the radical Republicans are looking and they're like, no. That's totally not how it works. Congress makes the decision about when states can come back. And they're like, we believe that these new Southern governments should be dissolved. We should have new ones where those, rebels are excluded from power and black men are guaranteed the right to vote. And so radicals, again, these are the truly the most vociferous abolitionists and people that are trying to really punish the South and make sure that African Americans have the rights. They're like, this is the perfect time to institutionalize equal rights for all, regardless of race. But most Republicans weren't radicals. They were moderates. And they're like, yeah, Johnson's plan is flawed, but like, can we work with him to modify it? And they're like, you know what? Like, it's too early to push suffrage. Like, Northern whites, Southern whites, no one's really ready for that. But the moderates and the radicals both say, you know what? These Southerners that have been reelected to Congress, they can't be seated. Like, Congress actually makes the rules of who gets to be seated. And they're like, you're not part of this. Okay. Like, you guys can't come back. But the radicals had said, you can't even have those Southern governments. The moderates are like, you can. So again, there's dissension within that party. And in 1866, you're going to see a move of like trying to modify Johnson's plans. And the first move that was made was to try to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, which I talked about in the last lecture, which had really only been established for a year. And they were like, we want to have it again. Okay. And the second part is the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which at the time was considered to be incredibly momentous because for the first time, it defines all persons born in the United States as citizens. That means if you're born here, you are a citizen. And it spells out the rights that citizens enjoy with, not taking race into a factor at all. And equality before the law is crucial here because it's basically saying that states can no longer enact laws like we saw with the slave codes or the Black Codes, after the war, discriminating between Black and white citizens. And according to this law in 1866, no state could deprive any citizen of the right to make contracts, bring lawsuits, or enjoy equal protection of their person and their property. Now, again, this law makes no mention of the right for Black people to vote, but it is historic in constitutional terms because it represents the first attempt to define in law what the essence of freedom is. So basically, the 13th Amendment freed slaves, but the 1866 Civil Rights Bill is designed to really spell out what those freedoms are going to be. Now, Johnson looks at both of these bills, the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, and goes, nope, vetoing them both. And he goes, both of these would give too much power to the national government and deprive the states of the authority to regulate their own affairs. Now, remember, the Republican Party is much more a party of big government, just as the Whigs have been and the Federalists have been, but Johnson's not really a Republican. I mean, he was sort of a convenient guy to bring on board. So again, he's a Southerner at heart in many ways from Tennessee. And plus, he's a total racist. Like, that's really an unfortunate part of him. And he goes, Blacks do not deserve the rights of citizenship. So I'm not going to be on board for any of this. And unfortunately, Congress tries to override his veto of the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. It doesn't work, but they do actually get it later in 1866. But they do, in fact, override his veto for the Civil Rights Bill. The first time in American history where they override a presidential veto. So again, this is momentous in terms of taking on the president and saying, you disagreed with us, we're disagreeing with your disagreement. And now Congress has pretty much had enough. They're like, I can't believe we have to deal with this guy. And so they're going to try to take matters in their own hands. They don't have all the cards yet, but they're going to start making moves. And so they're going to approve ultimately the 14th Amendment, and they're going to send to the states. Because remember, it starts in Congress. It actually has to have 2/3 of both the House and the Senate, and it has to go out for 3/4 of all the states. The 14th Amendment is basically taking that civil rights bill of 1866 and putting it in the Constitution. A law could be repealed. An amendment, it's much more challenging to do that. So they're like, we're going to put it in the Constitution. So the 14th Amendment brings up this principle of birthright citizenship, except for Native Americans, and really gives the federal government the power to protect the rights of all Americans. And the amendment prohibited states from abridging the privileges or immunities of citizens or denying any person equal protection under the law. It's a really crucial term, equal protection under the law. And this is going to be something that Congress and even the Supreme Court are going to use many, many times in the future to sort of guarantee legal equality. However, as we have seen, the 14th Amendment does not actually deal with suffrage because, again, there's concerns like, I don't know if we can get this even passed if we put the right for Black people to vote in there. But it sort of does, because it provides that if a state denies the vote to any group of men, not all people, but men, that state's representation in Congress could be reduced. So it's got like a penalty if you don't allow people to vote, but it doesn't say necessarily that Black people can vote, okay? Now, it's really important to understand, going all the way back to the 3/5 clause, which had, again, given the South a political boost for the slaves that they had. The abolition of slavery is going to give the South 5/5. So it's not just 3/5 anymore. Every Black person that can vote can be 5/5. So in some ways, the South has an incentive to allow African Americans to vote, because the 14th Amendment is like, listen, you got a choice. Either allow Black men to vote and keep your full representation or in the House, or you don't get it. So even though the 15th Amendment is not there yet, which allows African American males the right to vote, the 14th Amendment sort of put the South in a position where there was going to be sort of an incentive. But Johnson, at this point in the fall of 1866, again, he's been president for just over a year, is going to start to dig his own grave. He doesn't like the radical Republicans are coming after him. So he basically goes out to try to get in the congressional elections of 1866. He's not running for president, but there's congressional elections. He goes and he's going to try to just announce, people don't like me. I'm going to go on, we'll say, on the stump and sort of denounce them. And he makes wild accusations about the radicals trying to assassinate him. He seems drunk a fair amount of the time, which is probably true based on what we know of him. And he just looks like a buffoon. And at the end of the day, he doesn't look very credible. The southern states, like we saw in Tennessee, we see this in Louisiana, so in Memphis and New Orleans, there are huge race riots that break out, in part because of the black codes that he has helped indirectly create, because he's allowed, the southern, elite to come back into office. And so in the elections that fall, Republicans win handily. So he went out to try to drum up support for candidates, and these candidates all lost. And so he looks like he's completely a man without any power whatsoever. However, he has basically said to the South, do not support the 14th Amendment, again, which has been passed by Congress. He's like, don't do it. So Congress looks at the situation as like, we just beat you up really, really badly, in the election of 1866. You went and tried to support these candidates. They all lost. You looked like a buffoon. You looked drunk. You looked racist. Plus, you're not supporting the 14th Amendment. It's our time. So now the Republicans have full control in the beginning of 1867, and Johnson is going to basically be powerless. So Congress adopts something called the Reconstruction Act, which basically is like, hey, South, you know what? We're going to divide you into 5 military districts. Like, we are going to bring in the military to oversee you, okay? We're going to create new state governments. Black people are going to be given the right to vote. Pardon me. Black males are going to be given the right to vote. Radical Reconstruction or Congressional Reconstruction has started. You are essentially under martial law, and Andrew Johnson, sorry, buddy, you've got no power. And the ways that they really show that he has no power is they try to impeach him, okay? They try to get him out of office. Now, impeach just simply means to bring charges, but it's the first step to presidential removal. And again, this is in the Constitution, but had never been done before. So in March 1867, with the radical Republicans really in control, they passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, which is probably unconstitutional in many ways. And they're basically like, you, the president, cannot remove certain office holders, including cabinet members, without the consent of the Senate. Now, what's interesting is that the Senate has to give their consent for people to be in the cabinet to begin with, but there's nothing about giving consent when he's going to fire them. Okay. Again, we saw President Trump fire many, many people, and the Senate didn't do anything because they can't. And again, this is just a way to try to trap Andrew Johnson, just because they knew that he was going to get rid of some like Lincoln loyalists. Okay. And Johnson is like, this is unconstitutional. Like this goes against checks and balances. And he calls the Republicans bluff. So he dismisses Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, an ally of the radicals that they knew he was going to get rid of. So they knew he was going to get rid of Stanton. They passed this law to say that he couldn't get rid of Stanton. And if he did, they'd have a reason to basically go after him. So the House of Representatives, approves the articles of impeachment. It basically says you are formally charged. Then it goes to the Senate where they have to vote. All right. That's really, really important. All right. So just because you're impeached doesn't mean that you're actually removed. And so for the first time in American history, a president is quote unquote on trial before the Senate for what is known as high crimes and misdemeanors. By this point, basically all Republicans are like, Johnson is a terrible president. We hate him. But some moderates are like, listen, we can't just remove him because we don't like him. This whole Tenure of Office Act is such a sham anyway. Like we can't do it. This would irreparably damage, all that the founding fathers created. And plus, Johnson's lawyers are like talking to moderate Republicans who are like, listen, if he's acquitted, if you just like let him stay in office, he'll stop interfering with Reconstruction policy. The final vote is 35-19, just one vote short of the 2/3 necessary to remove him. So he's not removed. So again, we've now had 3 presidents that have been impeached: Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. None were ultimately removed. And this was just the first. And now effectively, Johnson is done. He's going to serve out basically the last year of his term, but the radical Republicans are totally in control. So I'm going to end this now. I'm going to pick up the second part in a different recording. Thanks.